Right. Good morning. So here we are, and here's the part where it may start getting a little bit difficult for people um, because we're going to start moving into genetics, and we can begin with what we learned about evolution and then kind of transition in from there. Okay, so I think, let me see. Am I actually presenting? Okay, I am recording. All right. Sorry. No. And there. I'm assuming everybody can see that. All right. So yes, here's where we learn to give peas a chance, as it were. So Darwin publishes the big book that he wrote on his evolutionary ideas in 1859, enormous book that was going to have explained everything in agonizing detail, Indonesia, and the two men actually published a paper together, so both would get a share of the credit. And then Darwin cut down his enormous book to something only 400 pages and published it, called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, in 1859. It was a bestseller. It stirred up a great deal of interest and a great deal of controversy. But by about 1870, just about all scientists who had studied the matter agreed that some form of biological evolution was responsible for the diversity of life on Earth. Some kind of natural process that you could study using the scientific method was responsible for life diversifying from some protoplasmic globule or whatever it was, to everything from humans to cauliflowers to mushrooms and paramecium and all that. That was pretty well settled by about 1870, but there was still a great deal of debate as to whether natural selection was what caused it. Natural selection was not that widely accepted within Darwin's own lifetime, and it had a couple of great big gaping holes. The big one is that for natural selection to work, you can boil down natural selection to three principles. One is that living things vary. The second is that variation is heritable. That variation can be passed on. You look different from everybody else, and some of the things that make you look different from everybody else will be passed on to any offspring that you may have. And some of the things that make you look different from everybody else, you received somehow from your parents. Just like just like everybody says, I have my mother's nose and my father's eyes in a jar of formaldehyde under the bed. Just kidding. Joke there. But yeah, of course, you don't literally have your father's eyes. I hope not. But you may have eyes that look like your father's or your mother's or possibly your grandparents or something like that. So living things vary. Variation is inherited. Some of that variation affects your odds of successfully surviving and, more importantly, of reproducing. And then if you have one of those variations that increases your chance, you'll pass that variation on to all of the offspring that you have. I think Thursday's lab is actually going to demonstrate that. Or actually, I think your past Thursday's lab should already have done it. So for the whole thing to work, natural selection depends on variation and heredity. Now, both of those you can observe. You can see heredity in your own family. Certainly anybody who's ever, had kittens or, bred fancy guppies or something like that will have seen how heredity works, and variation you can see just by looking around. The problem was that Darwin couldn't explain how those worked, although to be fair, nobody else could either. Why should organisms vary? What makes organisms vary? And how is it that they pass that variation on? I mean, it's clear that you do look like your parents, but how did that actually happen? How is it that you can start out as a fertilized egg that has no eyes and end up as 37 trillion cells that include cells that make up an eye that looks like your father's or your mother's? Weird if you think about it. Big problem. How does that variation get passed on? And clearly variation's real and it does get passed on, but most people felt Darwin's ideas were critically incomplete without an explanation of variation and heredity. And there were all kinds of alternate non-Darwinian evolutionary theories that were passed around and debated, and there were attempts made to test them. Natural selection was definitely not the only possible explanation for why evolution happened. The guy who filled in or started the process of filling in those holes lived and worked here. This is the Abbey of St. Thomas in the city of Brno. And yes, that is spelled correctly. The Czech language runs a little bit short on vowels. So the city is actually called Brno in what's now the Czech Republic. At the time, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for anybody who has taken European history. And in 1843, a guy named Johann took his vows as a Benedictine monk in the Roman Catholic Church. So he was ordained a priest. He became a Benedictine. He lived here and taught here. He did go to university for a time at the University of Vienna and came back to teach science in the monastery school in Brno. So he was essentially high school science teacher. And he was born Johann, but he's better known by the name that he took when he took his monastic vows. He became known as Brother Gregor. So there is Brother Gregor, who'd come back to studied at the university, come back to teach in the monastery school, a good teacher as far as I ever heard. In his spare time, he was actually an amateur scientist. He did, research into various problems and was interested in a lot of things. He'd grown up on a farm and knew about heredity because it's the kind of thing you can see if you've ever raised livestock. And he got interested in the problem. How did living things make their offspring look like themselves? The story is that at first he wanted to do some experiments, and he wanted to breed rabbits. The story goes that the head of the monastery, his abbot, told him that he couldn't breed rabbits because, as everybody knows, rabbits, do it like rabbits. Rabbits would have a lot of sex, and sex is just not the kind of thing that a proper monk is supposed to be thinking about. So he got his abbot's permission to try some experiments breeding something that was less likely to make the monks think about sex all the time. And he did experiments using common garden peas, Pisum sativum, the same garden pea that you've probably eaten many times in your lives. Why garden peas? There's a concept here that we're actually going to come back to several times, and it's the concept of what we call a model system. If there's some feature of biology that you want to study, oftentimes there is a species of animal and plant that just happens to be very convenient for studying that thing. And we might call that species of animal or plant a model system. And peas were a good model system for experiments. They're easy to grow. When you're finished with them, you can eat them. And more importantly, they're variable. They come in a number of different varieties. So up there at the top, you can see a purple flowered pea and a white flowered pea. Same species. They just happen to vary in flower color. I think if you buy peas, just to grow in your garden, most of the varieties are going to be white flowered peas, but there are purple flowered peas as well. Down there at the bottom, at the left, that's a so-called inflated pea pod. At the right, those are so-called constricted pea pods, and you might be able to see that the constricted pea pods have these little bumps in them because the pod has kind of shrunk a little bit around those peas. So there's a kind of bumpy appearance to those constricted pods as opposed to the inflated pods over there on the left that look like they've been blown up like a balloon. And there's others. There are tall peas and dwarf peas. There are peas with flowers that branch off the sides and peas with flowers at the tips of the stems. There are peas with yellow seeds and peas with green seeds, peas with yellow pods and peas with green pods, and so on. Lots of different varieties of peas out there that had been produced by our old friend, artificial selection. People saw peas with interesting traits and said, hey, that looks cool, and bred them. There's something else. Flowers are plant sex organs. It may be a little bit strange the next time you go to a garden and think that what you're looking at is basically sex organs, but that is what plants make flowers for. They're waving their sex organs out in the breeze. Some flowering plants will have separate male individuals and female individuals. The example I can think of off the bat is kiwi fruit. I'm sure you've seen kiwis in the grocery store, kind of a shaggy brown outside and usually a kind of bright green, very tart and delicious inside. Well, if you plant kiwis, you have to plant about one male plant for every 8 or so female plants. Other flowering plants, there will be flowers with male parts and flowers with female parts, but they'll be on the same plant. The example I can think of off the top of my head would be squash. But for, I think, the majority of flowering plants, there are both male organs and female organs in the same flower. Sometimes they may not mature at the same time because that keeps the plants from inbreeding. But typically you'll get male and female parts in the same flower. And peas do something unusual in that their sex organs are completely enclosed by those central petals. If you look at this pea flower, you can see that there's a couple of kind of, wing-like petals that are, on the outside. These are called papilionaceous flowers, coming from the French word for a butterfly, papillon. So you've got the flowers that look like the butterfly wings, and then in the center, there's some petals that are kind of rolled up to almost a cone. And the pea flower sex organs are inside that cone. And normally, pea flowers self-fertilize. The male parts of the pea flower fertilize the female parts of the pea flower. Kind of, sort of the ultimate in inbreeding there. You can't tell a pea plant to go screw itself, because the plant will go, yeah, so what? Right. And here's what this looks like. If you look at where it says section down below, deep down at the base of the flower, there's a structure called the ovary, and that includes the actual egg cells. They are wrapped up in some thick parts called carpels. When the eggs are fertilized, they will develop into seeds, and the ovary is what will swell up and elongate, and the petals will fall off, and the ovary will eventually give rise to the pod with all of the seeds inside. So the egg cells are in the ovary. That ovary leads to a long structure called the style, and at the tip of it, over on the left, the tip of what's called the style is called the stigma. Okay. Surrounding the ovary and the style and all that, you have little filament-like parts called the stamens. And at the tip of every stamen, you've got a structure called an anther, A-N-T-H-E-R, and the anthers produce pollen. Pollen is technically not sperm. We don't really have time to get into what pollen really is, but you can pretend for our purposes that pollen is like sperm. More to the point, pollen contains the sperm. Every pollen grain is, a little microscopic grain that's got the sperm and a couple of other cells packaged inside. So think of that in March when you have all of that pollen falling on your car. Whenever you go and wash it, you're washing off plant sperm. I'm sure you really did not want to think of that, but so it goes. Right. In a typical flower, the pollen would be made on the anthers and then would get to a different flower, either because something like bees are carrying it, or in some cases because wind is blowing it, or something like that. We can talk about pollination later. But a pollen grain would end up on the stigma, and the pollen grain actually grows a little tube, and the sperm travels down the tube all the way down to the ovary and fertilizes the eggs. Now, in most flowers, a flower's eggs would be fertilized by sperm from a pollen grain from a different flower. In the case of peas, the eggs get fertilized by sperm that were made by the same flower. Mendel found, and that was his full name, by the way, Brother Gregor Mendel, found that he could crossbreed pea plants. Normally they would self-fertilize, but what he could do is cut open the flowers with a sharp knife, pick up pollen from one flower and move it to the other flower with a very fine brush, and then seal the flowers up again with a little wax. And that had no bad effects. The plants survived the surgery and were quite able to reproduce that way. The reason why I'm dragging you through all of this detail is that the particular type of flower here means that Mendel could control which plant was crossbreeding with which plant. If you think about, I don't know, clover flowers on your lawn or something like that, those certainly produce pollen. That pollen gets picked up by pollinators, usually honeybees, and carried to other flowers, and any clover flower could interbreed with any other clover flower. You have no way of controlling what clover plant is breeding with what clover plant. At least you don't have an easy way to do it. With peas, you can control it much more easily. All you do is cut open that keel in the middle and transfer the pollen with a brush. So you can be very sure of which plant has had offspring with which other plant. That's what made peas a really great model system. So he picked peas. He selected several varieties of pea that he knew bred true, which means that if you left them alone and you let them self-fertilize, they would always produce more of the same. If you planted dwarf peas and you just let them do their thing, you could save some of those seeds and plant them again next year, and you get more dwarf peas. And then seeds from that generation would produce more dwarf peas, and so on. For as long as you cared to keep growing, you were always going to get the same variety of peas. So we say that his varieties breed true. But he wondered what would happen if you crossed two different varieties. What would happen if you took a dwarf pea and crossbred it with a tall pea? Would you get all tall or all dwarf, or some tall and some dwarf, or all medium, or tall and medium and dwarf, or something quite different? You could make a lot of hypotheses as to what you would get if you crossbred two varieties with very different traits. And over the course of 8 years, Brother Gregor ended up raising 29,000 pea plants. There was a greenhouse in the courtyard of the monastery, and he raised his pea plants here. The greenhouse has now been destroyed, although I think they might have rebuilt it because the monastery is now a museum. Well worth a visit if you're ever in Brno. Once this pandemic is over, maybe some of you can travel there. Maybe. And yeah, so he raised 29,000 pea plants and crossbred them under very carefully controlled conditions. We can't look at all 29,000, but let's look at one set of his crosses. When he crossbred a purple flowered pea with a white flowered pea, all of the offspring had purple flowers. That X right there is just shorthand for crossbreeding. So when he took pollen from a purple flowered pea and put it on the stigma of a white flowered pea, all of the offspring had purple flowers. They took after the purple parent. And the same way, by the way, when he took pollen from a white flowered pea and put it on the stigma of a purple flowered pea, it worked the same. All of the offspring had purple flowers, regardless of which parent was providing the pollen. When he took two of the hybrid peas, the ones that he'd produced by crossbreeding, and crossbred them, what he got was white flowered peas and purple flowered peas together in the second generation of crosses. So that white flower color skips a generation. It's in the founding generation. It disappears in the first generation of crosses, but it shows up again in the second generation of crosses. Incidentally, you do need to know this. There's a standard abbreviation scheme for keeping track of generations. If you're doing a cross like this, the plants that you use to start are the parental generation, or just the P generation. The first generation of offspring that you get are called the F1 generation, and F stands for filial, which means having to do with sons or daughters. Having to do with offspring is what filial means. So the first filial generation is the F1. And then the second generation is the F2 generation, the second filial. And you could do an F3 and F4, however many Fs you cared to give. Did I just say that? However many generations you cared to run an experiment for, you could have F3, F4, F5, whatever you want. For what we're going to do here, you just need to know P, F1, and F2. But that's the standard scheme for keeping track of the generations in an experiment like this. So what can we conclude? There were other folks that had proposed that inheritance was a sort of blend, that it was like mixing paint. If you crossed a purple flowered pea with a white flowered pea, you should get light purple flowers. You know, the same sort of thing that you would get if you mixed purple paint and white paint. Mendel didn't find any evidence for that. Instead, what happened was that white flower color was present in the P generation. It disappeared in the F1, and then it popped back up again in the F2, just like it always had looked. The F2, let's go back. Those F2 white flowers didn't have purple spots on them or anything. There was no sign that they had ever had any purple flowered ancestry. You know, they were just as white as their grandparent P had been. They looked just the same. So Mendel concluded that inheritance was particulate, meaning that there must be some kind of little particles inside those P cells that make them look the way they do. Something like marbles. You know, if you think instead of mixing, like if you mix purple and white paint, you can't unmix that, right? You get light purple, and you know, you can't turn that back into pure purple and pure white. But if you were to mix some purple marbles and some white marbles, well, you could still sort the marbles out very easily, right? If you had a bucket of purple marbles and a bucket of white marbles and you poured them together, you could easily get back the original purple and white. It wouldn't be too difficult to sort them. So Mendel concluded that heredity was particulate. There were some sort of little marble thingies rattling around inside his pea plant cells that made them look the way they do. Mendel's word for these, by the way, was elements. I'll mention right now that we no longer call them elements. We've come up with a different word for them, and that word is genes. And you have probably heard this word, and we'll be coming to it in a bit. Genes aren't really little marbles rattling around inside cells, but for the moment, it will work as a metaphor. We'll get back later to a closer look as to what genes really are. The trait of purple flower color is dominant to the trait of white flower color, which is said to be recessive. Let's go back one and look in the F1 generation. When you cross a purple flowered pea plant with a white flowered pea plant, you get all purples, but you get white in the second generation in the F2. So that F1 generation must have purple particles or elements, and it must have white elements, but having the purples masks having the whites, covers up the fact that they've got whites. So we say that purple color is dominant to white flower color. Be it said, and this is worth repeating, but I'll say it right here, dominant does not, in this context, does not mean superior. Purple flowers aren't better than white flowers. They're not more common than white flowers. In fact, white seems to be most common in the pea flowers that I see today. Purple is not better. Purple is not superior. Purple does not beat up white flowers and take their lunch money. All that it means is that if you have a pea plant that has inherited both purple and white particles, the purple particles somehow cover up the fact that there are white particles there. The purple elements somehow manage to hide the white element. However, those white elements or particles can be passed on. They can be hidden, but they can reappear in future generations. Now, this probably would not matter a great deal, except first of all, Mendel found that he got the same pattern in the other 6 pairs of traits. He found that purple flowers are dominant to white flowers, round seeds are dominant to wrinkled seeds, yellow seeds are dominant to green. You can read the rest. Inflated is dominant to constricted, green pods is dominant to yellow, axial flowers is dominant to terminal flowers, and tall is dominant to dwarf. Okay, right. So it wasn't just flower color, it was true for all of the other traits that Mendel had studied. And for the record, in case you're beginning to wonder, why the hell do we have to go on and on about peas and don't even like eating them? The reason that this matters is that the rules that Mendel worked out turned out to apply. He didn't know this at the time, but the rules that he worked out basically apply with some variation and modification to every species of eukaryote. Bacteria and archaea get weird, but every eukaryote that I can think of, its heredity is explicable by modified versions of Mendel's laws. You might not particularly care about whether a pea plant has white or purple flowers, but there are more than 100 human genetic conditions that range from everything from cystic fibrosis to sickle cell anemia to different types of muscular dystrophy, things ranging from minor to lethal, and they follow the same rules that we're talking about here. They're caused by genes that may be dominant or recessive. I hope you never have to deal with these in your own family, but if you do, know that the same rules that Mendel worked out for peas apply to people equally well, with modifications and complications that we'll get to. That's why these pea plants matter. This was interesting, but not all that new, because a French scientist in 1751 named Maupertuis had studied a French family with a family history of polydactyly, which means extra fingers and toes. And he'd found the same thing. He had showed by basically working out a family history that polydactyly could also skip generations. And he thought he could explain this in the same way that Mendel did, by the existence of some kind of hereditary particles or elements. There's some kind of little marble things rattling around in your cells, and if you inherit certain ones from your parents, you'll end up with extra fingers. Okay, so Mendel so far was not doing anything radically new. What he did do that was radically new was he counted the number of pea plants in every generation. And he found that, okay, when he did his pea generation cross, and he crossed a purple flowered pea plant with a white flowered pea plant, all of the offspring had purple flowers. That's the F1 generation. But when he took 2 plants from the F1 and crossbred them with each other, the F2 generation that he got included 705 purple flowered plants, 224 white flowered plants, and that made 929. And if you divide all those numbers by 224, you get something very, very close to a ratio of 3-to-1. There are almost exactly 3 purple flowered plants for every 1 white flowered plant that you get. And I won't read all of this data, but he found the same thing in his other F2 crosses. When he did the type of cross that I've shown you with round and wrinkled seeds, the F2 generation, he got 2.96 round-seeded plants for every 1,850 wrinkled-seeded plants, and so on. Same thing with yellow versus green seeds. inflated versus constricted pods, yada, yada, yada. Okay, almost exactly 3 plants for every, with a dominant trait for every 1 recessive. That raises the question as to why. Mendel looked more closely at those plants down below, those plants in the F2 generations, and he tried letting those plants self-fertilize. Remember, if you don't do that song and dance with the paintbrush and the scissors, a pea flower will simply fertilize itself. And he found that if you let those white-flowered plants in the F2 generation self-fertilize, all you would get was more white-flowered plants for as long as you wanted to keep raising them. Your F2 would give you an F3 generation that was all white, which would give rise to an F4 that was all white, and so on. 1/3 of his purple-flowered plants in the F2 generation also produce nothing but more purple-flowered plants. But 2/3 of his purple-flowered plants would produce purple-flowered and white-flowered plants in that same 3-to-1 ratio. So the F2 generation consists of 2 different types of purple plants. 1 type of purple-flowered plant that produces only purple-flowered offspring, and 2 types of purple-flowered plant. Computer animation. 2 types of, okay, 1 type of purple-flowered plant that produces only more purples, and a 2nd type of purple-flowered plant that produces purples and whites in that same 3-to-1 ratio. Huh. What are we going to make of that? I'll tell you what, it is 9:47. I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a break, and we will resume at 10. So I'm going to temporarily stop presenting and stop recording, and give yourself a chance to get up and get yourself some caffeine, because you're going to need it for what comes next. Thingies, come on, icon thingies, where are you? There we are. So I will stop presenting. And I will stop recording.